Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today we have an episode of Commander's 2 Cents. On episodes like these, I give you my own personal take on topics about the format in general and current news. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And while you're at it, subscribe and review our podcast as well. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. On today's episode, we're going to talk about some more janky cards that I want to make work. Everyone has their own perspective on what exactly makes a card janky, but I think you kind of just know in your gut when you see the card. If you haven't seen the part 1 for this series of episodes yet, go ahead and check that out. On that episode, I cover Return of the Night Stalkers, Day of the Dragons, Form of the Dragon, and Skullstorm. But for now, let's get into today's episode and some more janky cards that I really want to make work. Today's first janky card that I really want to make work is Overlaid Terrain. Currently, it's only 28 cents and sees play in just 71 decks. It's an enchantment for 2 green, and says, as Overlaid Terrain enters the battlefield, sacrifice all lands you control. Lands you control have, tap, add 2 mana of any one color. So this is kind of more than a mana doubler because it allows your lands to tap for any color that you want. Regardless, there aren't too many budget mana doublers out there, especially ones that only benefit you. But the reason that this one doesn't see play, and it's budget, and it's janky, is pretty apparent. When it comes into play, you have to sacrifice all the lands that you control, and that's a huge downside. So when you play this, you're essentially setting yourself back to hopefully set yourself up for future turns. First of all, though, it's going to take you a lot of turns to catch back up to where you were. And you'd also have to ensure that you've got more lands that you can actually play. Let's say that you've got 4 lands in play when you cast this. You'd essentially break even after playing 4 more lands. Because if you hadn't played this, you'd be at 8 lands that each tap for 1, and if you do play this, you're at 4 lands that tap for 2. But it's not just a time factor that makes this risky. It's the fact that if this gets destroyed or even just bounced, you're going to be in big trouble. Sacrificing your lands for pretty much no reason is obviously not a very smart thing to do. Again, unfortunately, there just aren't too many budget mana doublers out there. So whenever I do see one, I like to try to find ways to make them work. The problem with this one is I really haven't found a way to make the reward outweigh the risk. If there's a way that you can consistently stifle or prevent that ETB, then you're good to go. Unfortunately, I really can't think of any commanders that do that type of thing. Some commanders that just might work out with this one, though, are Titania, Protector of Argoth, the Gitrog Monster, and Lord Windgrace. Titania can bring a land back from your graveyard when she comes into play, and then she has whenever a land is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, create a 5/3 green elemental creature token. If you've got a way to abuse her ETB somehow, you might be able to get some of those lands back. And at the right point, you might just be able to create a giant army by sacrificing all your lands at once. You're also probably running some Splendid Reclamation type effects in this deck, so you might just be able to get those lands back all at once too. But again, this is definitely a high risk, high reward play that can either win you the game or definitely lose it for you. And then the Gitrog Monster says you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. Now, unfortunately, it does say 1 or more, so you only get to draw 1 card no matter how many you sacrifice at once. You do get to play that extra land each turn, but you also have to sacrifice the Gitrog Monster unless you sacrifice a land during your upkeep. And then Lord Windgrace might be the most viable of these 3 because of its -3. It says return up to 2 target land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So with this one, you can actually recover pretty quickly and try to get ahead of your opponents. So although these 3 commanders might be able to try and make this card work, again, it's a high risk, high reward play. If someone happens to destroy or even just bounce Overlaid Terrain, you're out of luck. The next janky card that I want to make work is Planar Birth. Currently, it's $1.16 and sees play in less than 200 decks. It's a sorcery for 1 and a white, and it says return all basic land cards from all graveyards to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control. So this is like a Splendid Reclamation, but just for basic lands, and it helps out everyone. Now, I think that this one is less janky than Overlaid Terrain and has more potential to actually work. Although it has the potential to help out your opponents, it most of the time isn't going to. First off, plenty of decks out there run a good amount of non-basic lands, and the majority of decks aren't looking to mill themselves or sacrifice their lands. So the majority of the time when you cast this, most of your opponents aren't going to get back anything. Obviously, there will be exceptions to this, and there are some times where this might benefit your opponent heavily. But the potential that this has to help you can be absolutely absurd. If you're running a deck with a good amount of basics that's looking to mill itself, you should be good to go. For the most part, I think that many players lean too heavily on non-basic lands and don't include enough basics in their deck anyways. So if you have a self-mill deck with a proper amount of basic lands, this 2-mana spell should work great for you. Even just getting 2 or 3 lands back could make this worth it. But in the right deck, this could get you upwards of 10 plus lands and set you way ahead of your opponents. Getting lands back from your graveyard is typically a green thing. Splendid Reclamation sees a good amount of play and can be very powerful in the right deck. So white effectively having a version of this can be very powerful as well. and it really might be able to help out decks that don't have access to green. So some self-milled commanders that might want to consider Planar Birth are Varina, Carador, and Kethis. With Varina, the more zombies that you attack with, the more cards you draw, and the more that you discard. The more basic lands that you're discarding, the bigger your payoff is with Planar Birth. Again, Varina might not have access to green, but Planar Birth is a fantastic way for it to ramp. Commanders that have green like Carador and Kethis can take advantage of this too, though. The more cards that they mill, the more likely they are to get basics in their graveyard. So on top of things like Splendid Reclamation helping them out, Planar Birth can help them as well. Having some powerful redundant effects is usually a good thing in Commander. Again, Planar Birth definitely isn't for every kind of deck, but if you've got a deck that's got a good amount of basics and you're looking to mill yourself, you should definitely consider it. This is especially true for a deck that might not have access to green, because true mass land ramp is hard to find outside of that color. But now let's move on to our third Janky card of the day with Midnight Oil. Midnight Oil is currently 10 cents and sees play in just 77 decks. It's an enchantment for 2 black and it enters the battlefield with 7 hour counters on it. It says at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card and remove 2 hour counters from Midnight Oil. Your maximum hand size is equal to the number of hour counters on Midnight Oil. And whenever you discard a card, you lose 1 life. So this is somewhat of a Phyrexian Arena type enchantment. That being said, this does cost 1 more and there are definitely a lot of downsides to it. So let's break this card down really quick. It starts off with 7 hour counters on it, and each draw step you remove 2 of those counters. So the turn after you play this, you do get to draw an extra card, but your maximum hand size is then going to be 5. The next turn it'll be 3, then it's going to be 1, and then it'll be 0. So essentially in 4 turns you'll have drawn 4 extra cards from this, but your maximum hand size will be 0. On top of that, whenever you discard a card, you lose 1 life. Now losing life can definitely be mitigated if you can play the cards quickly enough out of your hand. Obviously though, there are some times that you can't avoid that if you happen to draw 2 lands or some other things as well. Now losing life or drawing cards usually is not that big of a deal, but in combination with giving you a max hand size of 0 is really a kick to the gut. When this card first came out, I probably reread it about 8 times to make sure I understood it correctly. And since then, I've been thinking of plenty of ways to try to make it work, and I think I might have found a few. Now the payoff of this card is obviously not that big, but there are some ways that you can make it work in a somewhat weird way. Hear me out, but some commanders that might be able to use this are Atraxa, Malfegor, and Villas. So Atraxa herself can proliferate, and you're probably running other things in that deck that can proliferate as well. If you can proliferate more than twice each turn, your maximum hand size will actually increase instead of decrease. Because again, the more hour counters that are on Midnight Oil, the larger your maximum hand size is. Now at first you might be thinking that Malfegor really doesn't work with this, but just bear with me. When Malfegor comes into play, you discard your hand and each opponent sacrifices a creature for each card discarded this way. So yes, you will lose some life when that happens, but a lot of Malfegor decks like to play Hellbent, meaning they've got no cards in hand. So Midnight Oil is kind of like a worse crafted Skullcap, but it still works for that deck. And this last one might be a bit strange, but hear me out. Villa says whenever you lose life, draw that many cards. Midnight Oil again makes you lose a life whenever you discard a card. Let's say that you've got a free discard outlet in play like Putrid Imp. By discarding a card, you lose a life, and then you draw a card. So essentially you can rummage for free, well at the cost of 1 life for each rummage. But essentially you can do this as many times as your life total allows. So essentially you can dig through your deck and fill up your graveyard, but you probably have some other payoffs as well. If you've got something like a Bone Miser in play, you're gaining a ton of value from discarding those cards. Or if there's a Psychosis Crawler in play and you've got more life than your opponents, you can just draw enough cards to kill them. Again, this is kind of a roundabout way to make it work, but it can. Keep in mind that you do have to be careful though once you get down to 0 hour counters with Midnight Oil. But now let's move on to our final Janky card that I want to make work with Zur's Weirding. Currently it's 46 cents since he's playing 619 decks. It's an enchantment for 3 and a blue, and it says, players play with their hands revealed. If a player would draw a card, they reveal it instead, then any other player may pay 2 life. If a player does, put that card into its owner's graveyard, otherwise that player draws a card. So first off, this lets all players see each other's hands. For certain decks, that can be extremely beneficial information. But on top of that, this is also a way to deny people of their draws. 2 life is not a lot for someone to pay, and for the right card, it's going to be worth it. The problem with this card is that you're probably going to aggravate all of your opponents and be the main target when this comes out. Meaning they can really just shut you out of drawing any cards and you're probably going to be stuck. But there are some decks that can abuse this effect by either getting around it or kind of pushing through it. And with those kinds of decks, you might just be able to shut your opponents out with this and not really affect you at all. Some examples might be Tomorrow, a Zombie's Familiar, Zedruu the Great-Hearted, and Muldrotha the Gravetide. Tomorrow says if you would draw a card, look at the top 3 cards of your library instead and put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So essentially your opponents can't actually stop you from getting that card because you're not drawing it, you're just getting it from your top 3. Instead of getting around the effect, Zedruu is more of a push through it. Zedruu can draw you a ton of cards and gain you a ton of life. When you're drawing a ton of cards each turn, it can be very hard for your opponents to keep up by paying that amount of life. Now they can obviously pick and choose which cards to give you and which cards not to give you, but at a certain point they're not going to be able to pay anymore. Conversely, you can use that life that you're gaining to shut them out and not let them draw any more cards. And then Muldrotha is basically another one of those get around it kind of effects because you actually want things in your graveyard anyways. Your graveyard is basically an extension of your hand, so if they put in your hand or your graveyard, it basically doesn't matter to you. So again, you can shut your opponents down, but they can't really stop you. Now in my eyes, Zur's Weirding is definitely a janky card, but it can also be perceived as a mean card. So just be cognizant of that if you're considering adding this to a deck. But now it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts are on these janky cards. And also let me know what your favorite janky card that you want to make work is. And make sure you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Again, a huge thank you to my patrons who help make this show possible. I truly couldn't do any of this without your support. If you want to support this channel directly, consider becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There are even tiers where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. You can check out all the Patreon tiers and rewards at patreon.com/commandersquarters. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.